So in fact, I noticed from the looking there that 75% used the staging system. I know that there were probably others who used both nutritional estimation as well. But the problem with the staging system is, particularly if you're a surgeon, is that you need something that is a little bit more accurate than what we have at the present time. I know that this is a rant that you've probably heard many times before, but I think the time has come when really something does need to be done about it. What a staging system needs to do is to tell you about prognosis, treatment choice, appropriate trials, and it should be there as a framework to help us to compare patient groups and outcomes. But there are problems associated with this. If we go back, now, I'm pressing forward and it's going backwards, so let's see what we can do. Right, we need a dynamic staging system, which is something which will help us, and it must change with technology and our knowledge of the disease. So let's go back to where we were in the 1960s with Robson's staging system. Robson, of course, made this huge contribution to surgery for renal cancer, but also to stepping up with this, really what at the time was an excellent staging system. So stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. And what you will notice if you look at it is that every single stage is aimed and tells you about the extent of the disease. So the extent of the disease, which is really what a staging system needs to tell us about, is what he said. And this lasted for many, many years until it was felt by people that something else was required. And the TNM or UICC, AJCC cancer staging then evolved. And as you can see here, there have been in total 7 editions of the TNM classification. And this is something that has happened and has helped it to evolve over the years. The advantages of the TNM classification are that it's updated every 6 to 8 years, and it is a clearly defined anatomical system. The disadvantages are that these updates are often conservative and fall perhaps a little bit short of the mark. The updates create difficulty comparing historical series because they change on a regular basis, and they don't account for age, gender, patient health, etc., etc. But there are other problems associated with the TNM classification as well. I think perhaps one of the things that is good about it is that the staging prefix does help, in other words, to define whether it's the clinical stage or the pathological stage, etc., etc. This, I think, is a significant advance forwards. So that certainly helps us. So let's just look at the various stages and just see where we are. So stage T1 initially was described not as relating to tumor extent, but as tumor size. So now we've got a new concept being introduced into the staging system. T1 is a tumor of less or equal to 7 centimeters, and then it was felt, well, perhaps that doesn't quite cover the whole picture, so let's just, if we can, make it a tiny bit more complicated and divide it into T1A and T1B, depending again on the size. And as we see, as time goes by, in fact, less than 4 centimeters and greater than 4 and less than 7 centimeters actually, again, isn't quite as accurate as we would like it to be. Then stage T2, which again refers to the size of the tumor. T2 tumor is greater than 7 centimeters in its greatest dimension, limited to the kidney. But once again, people realized that if a tumor was greater than 10 centimeters, this was a bit more different to a tumor that was less. So we then need to divide it into T2A and T2B. So now we have, instead of the initial 2 stages, we've actually got 4 stages, which are all related not to tumor extent, but to tumor size. And then suddenly we change to its tumor extent when we get to stage T3A. Now this was originally T3, but again, because of complexity, this had to be divided into T3A and T3B. T3A, of course, extending into the renal vein, but not beyond Gerota's fascia, and T3B, where the tumor grossly extended into the vena cava below the diaphragm, and indeed T3C, where the tumor grossly extended into the vena cava above the diaphragm, or indeed invaded the wall of the vena cava. Hugely now complex. Now we've got a total of 7 subsections of the first 3 types of tumor classification. So T4, of course, we know, and N1 and M1. But suddenly, as you can see, that this is a little bit inaccurate and inadequate. Because, of course, does size matter? Yes, it does, because as this graph shows, you can see that as the tumor size increases exponentially, so does the predicted probability of a metastasis developing. Therefore, the size does matter, but in a way that perhaps isn't covered by the classification. And also you can see that it matters right down to almost to the centimeter. So in other words, instead of 7, we might even have 10 different subclassifications of the early staging system. And tumor size matters not only in relation to distant metastases, but also to the development of nodal metastases. So therefore, the classification is good in that tumor size is important, but I don't think that that is covered when you actually see the classification as it is. We also have the problem, as we know, that the clinical stage is different in many cases to the pathological stage. And here you can see that the pathological size is nearly always smaller than the clinical size. And this is not only these, I just put up 3 series, but there are many, many more. T3, as I said, represents a watershed between size and extent. But it actually presents a problem preoperatively because T3, in fact, may be hiding as T1. Because you can see here from 2 series from very respected institutions showing that even when you have small tumors, which would classify as stage CT1A or T1B, you still have the possibility of distant metastases. And these are 2 series, one from the United States and one from Europe, and I can absolutely say that there are more. So once again, PT3 and M+ disease can be hiding under something that is actually T1 or T2. So this is the problem, and is there an answer? Well, the answer is, at the present time, no. It has to be that people will sit down and maybe try and find something that will help us to bridge that gap in a better way between the Robson classification and the TNM classification. I've just put down 1 or 2 difficulties here, but I've really outlined them for you. And I'm opening this up as a discussion point for people to think about during the meeting. It's always nice to have somebody who will come up and question current dogma without being afraid of taking the brickbats associated with that. So that's me. One of the possible solutions, of course, is that we, in fact, incorporate other things into this. And in fact, of course, it makes it more complicated, but it is important. And in addition to patient factors such as gender, age, and of course BMI, as Peter Clark is going to talk about in relation to nutritional status, but also the question of genetic markers, which are so important. The work which has come from UCLA, from Alan Pantuk and Ari Beldegrun, I think is extremely important. And this is something that is going to become more and more valuable, perhaps, as to answering some of the questions that a staging system should be answering. The paper, which I mentioned at breakfast time to Martin Gore, which his unit produced recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, tells us how important it is that we should have something which will incorporate the malignant phenotype of the cell. Now, having said that, as I'm sure he will be the first to admit, you are opening up another huge can of worms because of the difference and the Darwinian selection of the cells, which actually, in fact, may make that very difficult. So, just to leave you with that thought, the TNM classification is something that we use. The vote has shown that virtually everybody in the room uses it, but in fact, it is somewhat inadequate, and in my opinion, in serious need of change. Thank you very much indeed.